Hey listeners, if you like horror and fantasy, then this one's for you. This story will be a mini, or should I say pocket-sized, novel series, as well as other works I have in mind. That's not to say I won't be producing short horror stories going forward. Let me know what y'all think in the comments, if you like it or hate it, and why. I'm open to your feedback and responses. And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with all your friends and family. Enjoy War of the Realms, Book 1. Chapter 1. It was nighttime. How late it was, I had no idea. The last thing I remembered was being at camp with some friends I met the day before. They said they were also from out of the country. All of us were talking and having a good time. One of the girls suggested we played Truth or Dare with alcohol. If I remember correctly, her name was Mai. I must have gotten really wasted and blacked out. When I woke up, there was no one else around, and the camp was gone. I had the worst headache. Maybe I got drunk and wandered off or something, because this area doesn't look familiar at all. I couldn't see where I was going with the fog being so dense. It was strange, since I don't remember it being so foggy. I called out to my friends several times, but no one responded. Then, all around me, I could hear the whispers and wailings of something dreadful. The whispers sounded like they were coming from 1,000 voices, from both females and males. My attempts to get away from the source seemed impossible because it didn't matter where I turned, the voices followed. My head throbbed. I was cold and shivering as I stumbled through the white fog-filled maze of the forest with only a t-shirt and a pair of shorts. My breath hung in the air. My bare feet were wet and cold from the dew built up on the shrubs and leaves. How did it get so cold? Who knew Thailand could get this cold in the middle of summer? I need to find shelter, otherwise I risk getting hypothermia and freezing to death. After 10 minutes of wandering around aimlessly in the dark, I came upon a huge building at the edge of the forest. From a distance, I could see a faint orange glow emanating from the windows. I sprinted toward the building, leaving behind the dark, smoky airiness of the forest. As I got closer, I could see the large building was actually an old barn. It sat on an overgrown grassy field that hadn't been tended to in some time. Strangely enough, the barn, although old and worn, was in decent shape with not a vine on it. Stepping over the knee-high vegetation, I made my way to the double doors and pulled onto one of them against the grass until I was able to squeeze myself inside. Once inside, I placed a crossbar over the latches of the door to secure it. The barn was decently lit with oil lamps hanging from each beam supporting the structure. There were 6 in all. It was noticeably warmer inside. Except for the mountains of hay on both levels, the barn was empty. There was a wooden ladder leaning on the floor to the upper level. It extended to the one below it. I scaled it to the upper level, then pulled it up to prevent any pursuers from getting to me. I laid on top of one of the piles of hay and covered myself with more hay to keep warm. It wasn't nearly as comfortable as the bed at home, but it'll do for tonight. Home. Where was home? It seemed like a long way from this strange place. The thought of home was comforting, and it lulled me to sleep. I was awakened by loud banging, followed by the unmistakable whispers from the forest. They found me, I thought. I peered over the edge of the upper level to see the doors of the barn shaking from the violent barrage from outside. The doors buckled and groaned as something pressed itself against it. Whatever it was, it must have been incredibly strong and huge. Then came a deafening shriek, and with it, gale-force winds causing the whole building to quake. I covered my ears in an attempt to shield them from the piercing shrill of whatever ungodly creature was from outside, but to no avail. My ears started to bleed, the lamps below danced, and the flames within them flickered sporadically until they went out. The shrieking stopped, and the winds ceased at once. For a moment there was dead silence, then the whispers started up again. In the darkness, I noticed the mysterious white haze seeping inside from underneath the doors. More and more white smoke started to appear and form itself into a figure. The whispers grew louder as more fog appeared. It was something I've never seen before, and never thought was possible. I looked on in awe as the fog transformed itself into a transparent figure of a woman in a tattered gown with long, tangled hair. The strands of its hair seemed to be able to suspend itself in mid-air, almost as if it too were alive. The figure had chains draped and loosely wrapped around its body. They dangled off of the figure and dragged against the floor, jangling and rattling wherever the being went. There were no feet or legs present on its body. It simply just floated in the air. I was convinced then the very thing in front of my eyes was no doubt the legendary Ronghai demon of Sisopen village. It was intriguing when I read about it on the internet before visiting, but seeing it in person was truly terrorizing. I gulped hard and held my shuddering breath, goosebumps forming on every inch of my body. The wandering demon glided around the bottom level of the barn in search for me. All the while, the whispers continued. I slowly scooted out of its line of sight as it advanced. I followed the demon until it went directly below where I was hiding. I carefully crawled to the edge and poked my head down to see where it was. To my surprise, the thing was gone. Had it left? If not, where did it go? Could it get to me? There were a million things racing in my mind. Then came the screech from above, this time much sharper, louder, and the winds much stronger. I flipped onto my back, and my eyes widened. Nose-diving straight at me was the Ronghai, with its cadaverous arms outstretched. It was then that I came face to face with the predator hunting me. I froze there, my eyes locked with the dark hollows of a sinister skull. Its long hair swept back from freefall, no longer covering its face. I could see through it and into the rafters above. There was a glint of red in the blackness of its sockets as it pounced on me, wrapping its cold, bony hands tightly around my neck. All the while, it continued to screech alongside the whispers. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond until it was too late. I kicked, punched, twisted, and shouted, but it wasn't effective against the Ronghai's otherworldly strength. I could no longer breathe and was blacking out. I gasped desperately for air that wasn't there and became lightheaded. I prayed to God as I clawed helplessly at the evil demon's hands. The last bit of strength sapped away and the Ronghai's skeletal face started to blur into darkness. The whispers and screeching became distant and faint. Suddenly, there came a flash from beyond my peripheral vision, and my attacker was suddenly engulfed in flames. It let go of my throat and fled off screaming in agony with a dark figure darting after it. I rolled onto my stomach, teary-eyed, coughing and hacking as air filled my lungs again. In the background, I could still hear the Ronghai. I looked up and saw that an old bearded man with a fiery sword had cornered the flame-covered demon. Its long dark hair was raised up like a cat, but jagged and sharp like spines.
A hunter! I thought you were all extinct during the purge. You are the first I've seen in centuries,
the Ronghai said. Then the chains around its body started to unravel by themselves. 2 chains extended from its body into the air above itself, about 20 feet high. They arched like a set of twin scorpion tails ready to strike. The old man held his sword in front of him at the ready. The demon pointed at the old man.
No matter, I shall send you to the great beyond, to be with your ancestors. Now die!
Chapter 2. The chains rattled, then one of them swung down at the old man, but he quickly sidestepped the blow as the chain destroyed the floorboards below with a thunderous boom, spraying splinters in every direction. The other one came just inches from crushing the old man's skull, but he ducked it right in time. The old man rushed in to close the distance, but jumped to evade a low sweeping attack aimed for his legs. He then blocked an attack directed at his head, driving him backwards, where he had to reset his attack once again. The chains whipped at him with a dizzying array of strikes, alternating from low to high, then high to low. The Ronghai kept the old man on the defensive, but he was patient and careful, for he knew the Ronghai would eventually succumb to the fire already burning it alive. The old man ducked, dodged, and deflected the chain whips. There were a few times he managed to go on the offensive, but every time he got close, the Ronghai would back away and repel him with the quills of its hair and shriek attacks. As time wore on, the demon grew more frustrated and desperate, its attacks sloppier and less coordinated.
Why don't you just die?
The Ronghai yelled as it thrusted a chain straight for the old man's head. He dodged it and grabbed a hold of the chain. It recoiled, launching the old man into the air and towards the Ronghai's needle-like hair. While airborne, the old man produced a gourd bottle and guzzled down the contents. He let go of the chain, propelling himself over the Ronghai, and as he did so, the old man unleashed a stream of fluid from his mouth toward the demon below. The Ronghai instinctively brought its arms and hair to shield itself against the spray of liquid, but realized too late what had transpired as the smell of burning alcohol wafted into the air. The existing flames on the Ronghai further escalated, transforming its body into a giant fireball, and it screamed in pain. The last thing the Ronghai saw before perishing was the oncoming blaze from the old man's sword, standing on its tip, paved by a trail of alcohol. The old man admired the result of his handiwork as he stood behind the demon withering away into nothingness. With the death of the Ronghai, the souls it devoured for hundreds of years were finally released as orbs of light, each one giving off its own unique glow and color. Thousands of them gradually rose and disappeared beyond the rafters above the old man, illuminating the entire building. He clasped his hands together and prayed for them. The old man even said a prayer for his dead nemesis. Chapter 3. I stared in awe as the lights filled the ceiling of the barn. It truly was a beautiful spectacle, to say the least. Hell, all of it was, right down to the very last moment of the battle. The old man was amazing. I couldn't move like that, and seriously doubt any Joe Schmo could either. The man was a world-class gymnast, wielding a magic sword. There was no explanation for what I've just witnessed, except for the fact that everything was real, which was the trippiest part. I felt like I was part of a Tsui Hark film. With the light show going on, I almost didn't notice the barn. It looked old and run down, more so than I remembered. Through the windows, I could see that it was almost daylight. I was relieved. I looked back at the old man. Who was he? Some sort of warrior monk? A shaman, perhaps? My mom used to tell me stories about them from my great-great-grandma. Sadly, there weren't many of them left. I personally don't know any. She said they had the ability to traverse back and forth between the spirit and living realms. Their powers consisted of communicating with the dead, healing, and foresight. The powers and abilities differ from one another, but some of them even possessed powers to kill ghosts and demons. I wonder if this old man was one of those. He has to know something, I thought. There were many questions I needed answers to, but refrained from asking them until the end of the light show, since the old man was preoccupied. After it was over, the old man went over to his sword and pulled it from the floorboard with a crunch. The blade was no longer on fire. Aside from it being a double-edged sword of some sort, it looked rather ordinary, without the flames. The old man was shorter than me, but he looked well-built. He had on a traditional Chinese robe with strips of cloth crisscrossing where his forearm and ankles were. He had a silver head of hair and beard. His hair was long and tied neatly into a bun. He had the thickest set of eyebrows I've ever seen. They were angular, and it made him intimidating. The old man sheathed his sword, then dropped off the ledge without saying a word. I hurried after him using the ladder. He was already at the doors when I yelled for him halfway down the ladder. "Old man, wait! Don't leave me here on my own!" He hesitated for a second without turning around, then proceeded out the doors. "Wait!" I shouted. I dropped down the remaining rungs of the ladder and sprinted after him. The man was quick. He wasn't running, but he sure walked with a purpose, and was at least 50 paces away when I got outside. I finally caught up to him, and as I walked alongside of the old man, I asked him a series of questions, like who he was, where we were, what was the thing he killed, and how I'd be able to get back in town, but he ignored me and kept walking. We eventually walked back into the forest, although not the same way I came from. My feet started to hurt from the rocks, thorns, and branches, since I didn't have my shoes. I couldn't keep up with the old man's unrelenting pace. I fell further and further behind. At some point, I barely saw him anymore, but I limped on anyway. I couldn't tell how long it took when we finally reached our destination, but it felt like hours of torture. It was a clearing with a boulder next to a small stream. The old man was talking to another person sitting on the boulder. I hobbled past the edge of the trees and paused when I saw the familiar face. It was a young woman, still in the same plaid shirt and jeans I saw the previous night. I was torn between being upset and relieved. "My, that you?" I asked. "Hey, Tom," was all she said. Her eyes met mine for a second, then she looked down, almost as if she was embarrassed. "What happened to you guys last night? You're never going to believe what I went through." "Yeah, Long told me about what happened." I was confused. My eyes went over to the old man, then at her. "He told you?" "Yeah." "Wait, I don't understand. You two know each other?" I paused to think about it, then said, "How'd you know we'd be here?" "It's a long story," Mai said, continuing to avoid my gaze. I limped all the way to where Mai sat. "I almost died last night. I think I have a right to know." Mai finally told me the truth. Everything that happened the night before was planned, and everyone knew about it except me. She essentially told me I was bait, and the old barn was the cage. She went on to say that everyone in Sisopen village knew about the forest, but they couldn't get a volunteer or bribe anyone until I showed up. The worst part of it was some of the people even worshipped the Ronghai and offered it human sacrifices once a year. It was a tradition almost as old as the village itself, and also the village's darkest secret. Among the cultists were Sisopen's highest authority figures. Each of her friends had lost someone or knew someone who had lost someone to the offerings. Traditionally, the elders would pick a random name or the village would take volunteers. And as the times changed, the offerings were banned officially, but they were never stopped. Mai's younger sister disappeared 3 years ago and was never found. She was only 8 years old. Mai suspected the demon and its followers were behind it. She was an investigative reporter for a company in Bangkok and dedicated years of resources into trying to stop the offerings. Based on her findings, they had recently stopped, but something had changed. Somehow the Ronghai's reach had gone beyond the forest, and the number of missing children had increased. Not even the cultists were safe. It was because of this that the community of Sisopen finally joined together to fight a common enemy. By pouring their resources together, Mai found a lead on how to kill the demon once and for all. It led her to a remote village in China where she met Long. He was a descendant from a long line of demon hunters. Long and Mai couldn't stop the Ronghai by themselves, so they sought help from a powerful shaman named Shuri. It had been centuries since hunters and shamans had worked together side by side. Shuri was able to bind the demon to the forest, and even used the illusion of the old building to lure me into it as bait. The barn was actually an abandoned and decrepit lumber mill. Mai paused the story and said, "And the rest of it is history. If I could do it all again to stop the Ronghai, I would." I was taken back by her story. I couldn't even be upset at her. If given the circumstances, I probably would have done the same. I was at a loss of words. So I asked, "What happens now?" "We'll report back to the village and give them the good news. Tell them the terror is over. No one shall have to sacrifice their loved ones ever again," Mai said. "We will do what we can for the world, but times are changing," said a female voice from behind me. Surprised, I spun to see who the speaker was. An older woman stood a few paces from where I was. Her smile was warm and friendly. Though she was older, the woman didn't look as old as Long. Her beauty seemed to defy her age. The woman in her youth probably had many potential suitors. She wore a black dress that accentuated her slender and elegant features. It had various colorful patterns on it. The design was similar to that of the Hmong and other Southeast Asian mountain tribes. "And you must be..." "The name's Shuri," she said before I completed my sentence. Then she bowed. Pleased to meet you. That concludes Book 1 of War of the Realms, Night of the Ruanghai. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Until next time.